Picture a room at night, silent, still, and in that room, a man who has everything the world says matters. Fame, genius, family, wealth, and yet there is a question he cannot answer. A question that arrives each evening when the work stops and the house goes quiet. Why? Not why this happened or that, but why any of it? Why continue? Why wake tomorrow? Why keep building a life that will end anyway? Tonight, we sit with Leo Tolstoy at 50 years old, the author of two of the greatest novels ever written, a man celebrated across continents, a husband, a father of many children, and a man who almost did not survive his own question. This is not a story about depression, though it touched him. It is not about philosophy as an academic exercise, though he read every major thinker. It is about what happens when the life you built stops making sense, when success feels hollow, when meaning collapses not because something went wrong, but because you finally looked closely at what you had been avoiding, and then quietly, slowly, what it looks like to rebuild, not with certainty, not with dogma, but with something simpler. Something the peasants working his land seemed to know without needing to name it. By the end of this long night, we will walk through the collapse, the despair, the false exits, and the door that opened when he stopped looking for an answer that could be spoken. You do not need to have had Tolstoy's life to recognize this moment. Maybe you have felt it. The suspicion that you have been performing a role, that the version of you the world sees is not the version you know in the dark. Or maybe you are just tired. And you want to understand why tiredness sometimes feels like more than the body needing rest. Let your breath find its rhythm. There is no urgency here. We are simply going to sit with a man who asked the hardest question and see what he found when he stopped running from the answer. Chapter 2, The Triumph That Felt Hollow. In 1869, Leo Tolstoy finished War and Peace. It was over 1,000 pages. 6 years of work, a panorama of Russian life during the Napoleonic Wars. Hundreds of characters, families rising and falling, love and death and history woven into something no one had written before. The critics called it a masterpiece. Readers across Europe devoured it. Tolstoy was 41. At the peak of his powers, and 4 years later, he published Anna Karenina, another enormous novel, another triumph. If you have read it, you know the opening line. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. It became one of the most famous sentences in literature. Tolstoy's name was spoken in the same breath as Shakespeare, Goethe, Dante. He had done what most writers only dream of. He had written something that would last. And yet, by the time Anna Karenina was published, Tolstoy had begun to feel a growing emptiness. Not dissatisfaction with the work. The work was brilliant. He knew that, but the work did not answer the question rising inside him. What was it all for? He had written great books. They would be read for generations, but he would die. His children would die. Eventually, everyone who had ever read a word he wrote would die, and the earth would spin on, indifferent. So what did any of it matter? Let your shoulders drop. This is not a philosophical puzzle. It is a feeling many people know. The feeling that arrives after you achieve something you worked years to reach, and instead of peace, you feel nothing, or worse than nothing. You feel the question you had been too busy to hear. Tolstoy later wrote that he could not understand why he had lived, or why anyone did. He had health, he had love, he had work that mattered, and none of it touched the deeper question. He described it as standing on the edge of a precipice, seeing only an abyss ahead. The triumph that should have brought meaning instead revealed its absence. Chapter 3. Success without significance. Imagine for a moment that you spend your life building something: a career, a reputation, a family, a home. You do everything right, or close enough, and one day you step back and look at it all. And the first thought that arrives is not pride. It is, what was this for? Tolstoy had built an extraordinary life. He was born into aristocracy. The family estate at Yasnaya Polyana stretched for miles. Forests, fields, peasants who worked the land. He fought in the Crimean War and survived. He traveled Europe. He married a woman he loved. They had 13 children. He wrote stories that moved people to tears. He was respected, admired, financially secure. By every external measure, his life was a success. But success, he realized, was not the same as significance. Success could be measured, counted, pointed to. Significance required something else, a sense that life had meaning beyond its own continuation. And that sense was missing. This is where the trap closes for many people. You cannot argue with this feeling. You cannot logic your way out of it. Because the mind that asks, "What is the point?" is the same mind that would evaluate any answer you give, and it will always find the answer insufficient. Tolstoy knew this. He was brilliant. He could see through every answer before he finished asking the question. But he could not stop asking. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. You do not need to solve this tonight. We are just naming it. The gap between doing enough and feeling enough, the suspicion that the life you worked so hard to build might be missing something at its foundation. Tolstoy called it a meaningless absurdity, not because his life was small, but because no achievement, no matter how large, could answer the question that had no answer. Chapter 4. The First Shadow of Death. There are two kinds of death that haunted Tolstoy in his 50s. The first is the death everyone knows is coming, the body stopping, the final breath. That one he had thought about for years. It was inevitable, distant enough to ignore. But the second death was quieter. It was the death that happens while you are still alive. The slow erosion of meaning, the realization that you have been performing a role and the role no longer fits. This second death crept up on him. It began with small moments. A dinner party where he sat among friends, laughing at jokes, playing the part of the celebrated author, and feeling completely absent. A morning where he woke and thought, "I have to do this again." Another day, another year, another decade. And for what? The first brush with mortality came not from illness, but from a trip. In 1869, Tolstoy was traveling to buy an estate. He stopped for the night in a small town called Azimas. He rented a room, lay down, and something broke open inside him. A terror unlike anything he had felt before. It was not fear of a specific thing, not fear of failure or loss. It was the raw confrontation with the fact of his own existence. Why am I here? What is this? Why does anything exist at all? He later wrote that he felt he was going insane. He paced the room. He could not calm himself. The terror was physical. It gripped his chest, his throat. He described it as standing in a white square room with no exits. Just him and the unbearable fact of being alive with no reason for it. By morning, the feeling had faded, but it had left a mark. The question did not go away, it just waited. Let your breath move at its own pace. You do not need to have had Tolstoy's experience to recognize the shape of it. Maybe you have felt it. The vertigo of realizing that the life you are living is the only one you get. That time is not infinite. That the work and the striving and the accumulation will not save you. That one day you will stop. And everything you built will stop with you. Tolstoy could not unsee this. And once you see it, it changes everything. Chapter 5. A question that wouldn't stop. The question began simply. Why? Not why this or that. Just why. Why continue? Why build? Why love? Why work? Why wake up tomorrow? Tolstoy could not answer it, and the inability to answer it made the question grow. It was not that he lacked intelligence. He had read philosophy, theology, history, science. He knew the arguments. Life is a gift. Life has intrinsic value. Meaning comes from relationships. Meaning comes from work. But none of these felt like answers. They felt like rehearsed lines, things people said because they had to say something. He wanted proof. He wanted certainty. And certainty did not come. The question followed him everywhere. He would sit at the dinner table with his family, his children laughing, his wife Sophia managing the household with the same steady energy she always had. And he would feel like he was behind glass, watching a scene he no longer belonged to. He would go to his study, pick up a pen, begin a sentence, and the question would arrive. Why write this? Not because the writing was bad, but because in 50 years he would be dead, in 100 forgotten, in 1,000 the language itself might not exist. So why shape the sentence? Why care? This is what makes the question so dangerous. It does not attack the life directly. It attacks the ground the life stands on. And once the ground feels unstable, everything wobbles. Feel your feet on the ground, or the weight of your legs, or your hands resting. Tolstoy later wrote that the question became so persistent that it felt like a physical illness. He would wake in the middle of the night, his heart racing, his mind circling the same void, and he realized if he could not find an answer, he would not survive. Not because he wanted to die, but because life without meaning felt impossible to continue. The question was not philosophical, it was existential, and there is a difference. A philosophical question is something you think about. An existential question is something that thinks about you, that grips you, that will not let go until you answer it or it answers you. Chapter 6, Science Offers No Answer. Tolstoy turned first to science. He had always respected reason, logic, empirical truth. Surely science could explain what life was for, what made it worth living. He read, he studied, he spoke with doctors, biologists, physicists, and he found descriptions. Beautiful, intricate descriptions. Science could explain how life worked, the mechanics of cells, the chemistry of thought, the evolution of species. But it could not explain why any of it mattered. Science could tell him that he was made of atoms, that his thoughts were electrical signals, that his body would decompose and return to the earth. But when he asked, "Why should I continue?" science had no answer. Because science does not deal in should, it deals in is. It can describe the world, but it cannot tell you what to do with it. Tolstoy realized that science was answering a different question than the one he was asking. He was asking, what is the meaning of my life? Science was answering, here is how life functions. The two questions do not touch. He later wrote that science had no answer to the question of life. Not because science was false, but because it operated in a different domain. It could tell him what a heart was, but not what to live for. This is a trap many people fall into. They think that if they just understand enough, if they just read the right book, learn the right theory, master the right framework, meaning will arrive. But meaning is not something you discover through analysis. It is something you live, or do not. Let the next breath come slower. Tolstoy was brilliant, and his brilliance became a cage because he could see through every answer before it finished forming. He knew that science, for all its power, could not tell him why to keep going, so he turned elsewhere. Chapter 7, Philosophy Circles the Void. If science had no answer, perhaps philosophy did. Tolstoy had read widely. Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Schopenhauer, Hegel. He returned to them now with desperation. Surely The great thinkers had solved this. Surely someone, across thousands of years of human thought, had found a way to live with the question. But what he found disappointed him. Some philosophers argued that life was inherently good, that being alive was its own justification. But Tolstoy could not feel this. And when he pressed on the argument, it collapsed. Why is being alive good? Because it is natural, so is decay, so is death. Because it allows for happiness, but happiness fades, and unhappiness is just as common. Because it allows for virtue. But why is virtue valuable if the virtuous person dies just like the vicious one? Other philosophers argued that life's meaning came from rational thought itself, that the pursuit of truth was the highest good. But Tolstoy asked, pursuit toward what end? If the universe is indifferent, if all human knowledge will eventually disappear, if the sun will burn out and the earth will freeze and everything humanity ever thought will be erased, what does it matter if we thought it? He found Schopenhauer particularly honest. Schopenhauer had looked at the same void Tolstoy was staring into, and Schopenhauer's answer was bleak. Life is suffering. The will to live is a trap. The wise person minimizes desire and waits for death. Tolstoy respected the honesty, but he could not accept the conclusion because he had children. He had people who depended on him. And besides, even if life was suffering, the question remained, why not end it now? Schopenhauer had no satisfying answer to that either. Philosophy, Tolstoy realized, was better at describing the problem than solving it. The great thinkers could name the void. They could circle it. Some even stared into it unflinchingly. But they could not fill it. Notice where your body feels heavy. Tolstoy later wrote that all of philosophy fell into two camps. Those who said life was absurd and meaningless, and those who invented elaborate structures to avoid admitting it. Neither helped him, because what he needed was not a clever argument. He needed a way to live, a reason to keep going that his mind could not dismantle. And philosophy, for all its brilliance, could not give him that. Chapter 8. The Terror of Nothingness. There is a moment in every crisis like this where the question stops being abstract. It becomes visceral. For Tolstoy, that moment arrived repeatedly. Each time he tried to work, each time he lay down to sleep. The terror was not of death itself. It was of nothingness, the realization that nothing he did would last, that everything he loved would disappear, that his children would die, their children would die, and eventually no one would remember that any of them had existed. He imagined his own funeral, people mourning, his wife in black, his manuscripts preserved, and then 100 years passing, 200, 1,000, and all of it gone, as if it never was. This is the terror of nothingness. Not that life ends, but that life was never solid to begin with. That what felt important was just a story you told yourself to keep going. Tolstoy wrote that the terror came in waves. Some days he could distract himself, work on the estate, play with the children, pretend the question was not there. But at night it returned. He would lie in bed, the house quiet, his wife asleep beside him, and the void would open. He described it as a sensation of falling, of reaching for something solid and finding only air. Let your jaw soften. This is not a rare experience. It is just rarely spoken about. Because we live in a world that demands forward motion, progress, optimism, and the terror of nothingness does not fit into that world. So people carry it quietly. They wake at 3 a.m. with their heart racing. They scroll their phones to avoid the silence. They pack their schedules so there is no room for the question to arrive. Tolstoy could not do this. His mind was too relentless. And so the terror grew, until it became impossible to ignore. Chapter 9. The Lure of Self-Destruction. There was a moment when Tolstoy realized he could not keep living this way. Something had to change. Either he found an answer or he ended the question. He later wrote that he hid ropes from himself because he was afraid of what he might do if one was within reach. He stopped hunting because he carried a gun when he hunted, and he no longer trusted himself with it. This was not suicidal ideation in the clinical sense. It was something quieter. It was the realization that if life had no meaning, then there was no reason to continue. And if there was no reason to continue, then ending it would not be wrong. It would just be logical. He did not want to die, but he could not find a reason not to. This is the trap of pure reason. When you rely only on logic to justify your existence, you eventually run into a wall, because logic can dismantle any reason you give. I live for my family, but they will die too. I live for my work, but it will be forgotten. I live for pleasure, but pleasure fades, and suffering is just as common. I live because life is inherently valuable. But why? The mind can spiral this way endlessly, and for someone like Tolstoy, brilliant, relentless, unable to lie to himself, the spiral was inescapable. He later described 4 ways people respond to this realization, 4 exits from the question. Some people never ask it. They live in ignorance or innocence. Some people distract themselves. Pleasure, work, busyness. Some people accept the absurdity and keep going anyway. Strength or stubbornness. And some people end it. They step off the edge. Tolstoy saw all 4 paths clearly, and for a while he stood at the crossroads, not knowing which way to go. Feel the air moving in and out. You do not have to do anything, just notice. What saved him was not an argument. It was an observation. Most people were not standing at this crossroads. Most people, especially the peasants he knew, the laborers working his land, seemed to live without this terror. They did not have brilliant answers. They did not read philosophy, but they woke each day. They worked, they loved, They endured, and they did not seem tortured by the question that was destroying him. Why? This question, this small shift in focus, was the beginning of his way out. Not through philosophy, not through science, but through something simpler, something he had overlooked because it was too obvious. Chapter 10. 4 Ways People Escape. Tolstoy realized that most people do not spend their lives asking why. They do other things instead. He began to study this, not in books, but in the people around him. And he saw 4 patterns, 4 ways people live without confronting the void. The first was ignorance. Children live this way, and some adults never leave it. They do not ask the big questions. They live in the immediate, the next meal, the next task, the next moment. For them, life is simply what happens. There is no need to justify it. Tolstoy envied this, but he could not return to it. Once the question is asked, it cannot be unasked. The second was pleasure. These were the people who filled their lives with distractions: parties, wine, sex, entertainment. They knew on some level that life was meaningless, but they chose not to think about it. They kept moving, kept consuming, kept seeking the next sensation. Tolstoy tried this, but it did not work, because pleasure fades. And when it fades, the question returns. Louder than before, the third was work. These were the people who threw themselves into productivity. Building, creating, achieving. They knew life had no ultimate purpose, but they acted as if their work mattered anyway. Tolstoy admired this. It took strength or delusion. He was not sure which, but he could not do it, because his mind would always ask, why build if it all ends? And the fourth was faith. Not intellectual faith, not belief as a conclusion, but faith as a way of life, a trust in something beyond reason. This was the path of the peasants, the laborers, the ordinary people who seemed to endure suffering without breaking. They did not have answers, but they had something else, a sense that life was given, not earned, not justified, just given, and that the proper response to a gift is not to question it, but to receive it. This was the path that intrigued him, not because it made logical sense, but because it seemed to work. Let your shoulders drop. These 4 paths are not unique to Tolstoy's time. You see them today, everywhere. People who never ask the question. People who distract themselves endlessly. People who work until they drop. People who trust something larger than themselves. None of them are wrong, but not all of them lead to peace. Tolstoy realized that ignorance was no longer available to him. Pleasure was empty. Work was a treadmill. That left faith, but faith of a specific kind, not inherited, not institutional. Faith built from the ground up, in the dark, with no guarantees. Chapter 11, Pleasure as Forgetting. And Tolstoy understood the lure of distraction. He had lived parts of his youth this way: gambling, drinking, the company of women. He had chased pleasure the way young men often do, as if the next thrill would finally be the one that satisfied. But it never was. Pleasure, he realized, is not a solution to meaninglessness. It is a way to forget the question temporarily. And forgetting is not the same as answering. He watched the people around him who lived this way. They laughed, they drank, they filled their evenings with noise and their days with shallow conversation. And beneath it all, he could see the fear. The fear of silence. The fear of being alone with their own thoughts. Because in silence, the question returns. If you spend your whole life running from a question, you never actually escape it. You just postpone the confrontation. And the longer you postpone it, the louder it becomes when it finally arrives. Tolstoy had tried this path, and it left him empty. Not because pleasure is inherently bad, but because pleasure without meaning is just sensation. It fills time, but it does not fill the void. Think of someone you know who is always busy, always planning the next event, the next trip, the next purchase. Not because they love these things, but because stillness feels unbearable. That was the pattern Tolstoy saw. Pleasure as avoidance, not as joy. And avoidance, no matter how elaborate, is not freedom. He later wrote that this path leads nowhere. It is a treadmill. You keep running, but you never arrive, because the destination you are running toward does not exist. Let the next breath be slightly slower. Pleasure as forgetting is one of the most common responses to the question of meaning. We live in a culture built on it. Constant stimulation, endless options, the promise that the next thing will finally be enough. But it never is. Because the question is not about what you have, it is about why you are, and no amount of having can answer that. Chapter 12. Work as numbness. If pleasure did not work, perhaps work would. Tolstoy knew people who lived this way. They woke early, they worked late, they built empires, raised families, created legacies, and they did not seem to be tortured by the question, not because they had answered it, but because they were too busy to ask it. This is work as numbness, not work as meaning, but work as a way to avoid the silence. Tolstoy admired these people, their discipline, their focus, their ability to keep going. But he could not join them, because whenever he tried to throw himself into work, his mind would interrupt. Why? Why build this? Why finish this sentence? Why plant this tree? In 100 years, it will not matter. In 1,000, it will be gone. So why act as if it does? The workers he admired seemed to have a gift he lacked, the ability to live as if their work mattered without needing proof that it did. He called this strength or stupidity. He was not sure which, but he could not do it. His mind was too honest, too relentless. It would not let him pretend. Notice where your body touches what is beneath you. Work as numbness is another common path. We see it everywhere. The person who works 60 hours a week, not because they love the work, but because stopping feels dangerous. The parent who fills every minute with their children's schedules, not because the children need it, but because emptiness feels unbearable. The retiree who cannot sit still, who finds a dozen projects, who keeps moving because stopping means facing the question, now what? Tolstoy saw this pattern clearly, and he saw that it was not a solution, it was a postponement. Because one day the work ends. The children grow up. The body slows down, and the question is still there, waiting. Work can give structure, but it cannot give meaning unless the work itself is rooted in something deeper. And that was the problem. Tolstoy could not find that deeper root, so work felt hollow, even when it was brilliant. Chapter 13. Reason as a Trap. The third path was the one Tolstoy had taken, and it had failed him. Reason. He had tried to think his way to an answer. He had read, he had analyzed, he had broken down every argument, tested every claim, examined every philosophical system, and reason had led him to a dead end. Because reason by itself cannot generate meaning. It can only evaluate it. Reason can tell you if an argument is consistent, but it cannot tell you what to care about. It can analyze values, but it cannot create them. Tolstoy realized that his own brilliance had become a prison. He could see through every answer, and because he could see through them, none of them held. This is the trap of pure rationality. If you rely only on logic to justify your existence, you will eventually dismantle every justification, because logic operates on premises, and the premises themselves cannot be proven by logic. Why should I care about my family? Because I love them. But why should I care about love? Because it feels good. But why should I care about feeling good? Because at some point you hit bedrock, a place where reasons stop, where you either accept something or you do not. Tolstoy could not accept without proof, and there was no proof, so reason became a trap. The more he thought, the less he could live. Let your jaw soften. This is not a rare pattern. Many intelligent people fall into it. They think that if they just understand enough, clarity will come. But clarity and meaning are not the same thing. You can have perfect clarity about the mechanics of life and still feel completely lost about why to live it. Tolstoy later wrote that reason is a tool, but it is not a foundation. It can help you build, but it cannot tell you what to build or why. For that, you need something else, something that comes before reason, something reason can serve but never replace. Chapter 14. Faith as a Question. The fourth path was faith, but not faith as Tolstoy had understood it growing up. Not faith as accepting what the church said. Not faith as following tradition, faith as something else, something harder to name. He saw it in the peasants. They did not have answers. Many of them could not read. They knew nothing of philosophy or science, but they lived. They woke each day, they worked the land, they raised their children, they endured hardship without complaint. And they did not seem haunted by the question that was destroying him. Why? This became Tolstoy's new question. Not what is the meaning of life, but how do these people live as if life has meaning? He began to watch them closely. Their rituals, their prayers, their way of speaking about life, and he noticed something. They did not justify their existence. They received it. Life was not something they had earned or something they needed to defend. It was a gift from God, from the earth, from something larger than themselves. And the proper response to a gift is not to question it, but to use it well. This was faith, not as belief in specific doctrines, but as a posture toward life, a trust that life is given, that it has a source, that there is something worth living for, even if you cannot name it. Tolstoy did not accept this immediately. His rational mind resisted. How could they be so sure? How could they live without proof? But then he realized they were not sure. They just trusted. And trust is not the same as certainty. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. This was the shift. Tolstoy had been seeking certainty, an argument so airtight that doubt was impossible. But certainty does not exist. Not about the biggest questions. What exists is trust, a choice to live as if life matters, not because you can prove it, but because the alternative is unbearable. The peasants had this, and it gave them something he lacked. Not answers, but peace. Chapter 15, Listening to Ordinary Life. Tolstoy began to change the way he listened. He stopped reading philosophy, stopped searching for the perfect argument, and started watching the people who seemed to have what he needed. Not the educated, not the wealthy, not the ones who could explain themselves in elegant sentences, but the ordinary people, the ones who worked with their hands, who lived close to the earth. He spent time with the laborers on his estate. He sat with them, ate with them, asked them questions, and what he found surprised him. They did not have a theology. They had a way of life. They prayed, but not in the formal way the church taught. They prayed like they were talking to someone who listened. They worked hard, but they did not worship work. They worked because the work needed doing, and because doing it well felt right. They suffered loss, illness, hunger, but they did not collapse under it. They endured, and they did so with a quiet dignity that baffled him. Where did this come from? Tolstoy realized it came from faith, but faith of a specific kind, not faith in an institution, not faith in a set of rules, Faith in something simpler, the belief that life is given for a reason, and that the reason does not need to be understood to be real. This was not irrational, it was pre-rational. It came before logic, before analysis, before the need to justify. It was the ground on which everything else stood. And Tolstoy had been so busy building arguments that he had forgotten to check the ground. Let your breath move at its own pace. There is a kind of wisdom that does not come from books. It comes from living, from enduring, from choosing to keep going even when the reasons are not clear. The peasants had this wisdom, and Tolstoy, for all his brilliance, did not. So he began to learn from them, not by reading about them, but by being with them, by listening to how they spoke, by watching how they lived. And slowly, something shifted. Chapter 16, The Wisdom of the Peasants. There was one man in particular. Tolstoy never named him in his writings, but he described him. An old laborer, bent from decades of work, face weathered, hands rough. He could not read. He had never traveled beyond the village. He owned almost nothing. And yet, there was something in him that Tolstoy envied. A peace, a steadiness. Tolstoy asked him once, "Do you ever wonder why you are here?" The man looked at him as if the question was strange. "I am here to work," he said, "to feed my family, to serve God." "But why?" Tolstoy pressed. "What is it all for?" The man thought for a long time. Then he said something Tolstoy never forgot. For itself. Not for an outcome, not for a reward, not to achieve something, just for itself. Life was not a means to an end. It was the thing itself. The work was not a path to meaning. The work was the meaning. The love was not a strategy. The love was the point. This was the wisdom Tolstoy had been searching for, and it had been here all along. The peasants did not need to justify their lives because they were not trying to achieve anything beyond living well. They did not ask why, because the answer was embedded in the doing. You work because the work needs doing. You love because love is what humans do. You endure because life is endurance. And all of this, the work, the love, the endurance, is not separate from meaning. It is meaning. Notice the stillness around you. Tolstoy later wrote that the peasants lived by faith, but not blind faith. Faith that arose from the act of living itself. They did not need to prove that life was worthwhile. They demonstrated it every day. By continuing, and continuation in the face of suffering and uncertainty is its own kind of proof. Not logical proof, but lived proof. The kind that cannot be argued, only witnessed. Chapter 17, Seeing Life as Given. Tolstoy began to understand something fundamental. The question, what is the meaning of life, was the wrong question. It assumed that meaning was something you could discover, like a hidden object or a secret code. But meaning is not found, it is lived, and the way you live it depends on how you see life in the first place. If you see life as something you possess, something you own, control, justify, then meaning becomes a problem, because possession requires justification. Why do I have this? What is it for? But if you see life as something given, as a gift, a trust, a responsibility, then the question changes. The question is no longer, why should I continue? The question becomes, what should I do with what I have been given? This was the shift that saved Tolstoy. He stopped trying to justify his existence and started asking how to live it. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but with intention. The peasants understood this. They did not own their lives, they received them from God, from the land, from the generations before them, and they passed them forward to their children, to the community, to the work they left behind. This was faith, not as a set of beliefs, but as a way of seeing, a recognition that you are not the source of your own life, you are the steward of it. And a steward does not need to justify the gift, they just need to honor it. Let the next breath come slower. This is not an easy shift to make, especially for someone like Tolstoy, someone brilliant, someone used to control, someone who wanted certainty. But it was the only shift that worked. Because you cannot think your way into meaning, you have to live your way into it. And living requires trust. The trust that life is worth continuing, not because you can prove it, but because the alternative is unbearable. Chapter 18. Religion Beyond Institutions. Tolstoy began to reconsider religion, not as he had known it growing up, not as ritual and hierarchy and obedience, but as something deeper. He returned to the Gospels, to the words of Jesus, to the Sermon on the Mount, and he read them differently now, not as commandments from an authority, but as instructions for living. Do not resist evil. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. Give to those who ask. These were not abstract principles. They were practices, ways of being in the world that changed how you experienced it. Tolstoy realized that religion, at its core, was not about doctrine. It was about transformation, not of the world, but of yourself. The peasants understood this. They did not argue theology, they lived it. They forgave because holding grudges was exhausting. They gave because hoarding made them small. They endured because fighting reality was futile. This was religion as Tolstoy came to understand it. Not a system of beliefs, but a way of life. And it worked. Not because it was provable, but because it was livable. He later wrote that the Church had buried the teachings of Jesus under centuries of ritual and dogma. But the teachings were still there, simple, direct, radical. And they offered something philosophy could not, a way to live. Even without answers, feel your feet on the ground, or the weight of your legs. Tolstoy did not become a conventional believer. He rejected the church, the priests, the sacraments, but he embraced the core, the teachings, the ethics, and it gave him a foundation, not of certainty, but of direction. He knew what to do, even if he did not know why, and that was enough. Chapter 19, the Sermon on the Mount. There is a passage in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus sits on a hillside and speaks. It is called the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Tolstoy returned to these words again and again, not because they were comforting, they were not, but because they were clear. They did not ask him to believe impossible things. They asked him to do difficult things. And in the doing, meaning emerged. This was the shift. Meaning did not come from understanding, it came from action. Not action for the sake of achievement, but action as a way of being. You do not turn the other cheek because it solves the problem, you turn it because it changes you. You do not love your enemies because they deserve it. You love them because holding hatred corrodes you. You do not give because it is rational. You give because generosity opens something in you that hoarding closes. This was what Tolstoy had been missing. He had been searching for a reason to live, a justification. But justification is not what sustains life. Practice is. The way you move through the world, the choices you make, the posture you take toward suffering and joy. That is what gives life meaning. Not the grand answer, but the daily act. Let your shoulders drop. The Sermon on the Mount became Tolstoy's guide. Not as law, but as practice, a way to live that did not require him to have it all figured out. He could be uncertain, doubting, struggling, but he could still act, still love, still give, and in the acting, the loving, the giving, meaning arose. Not as a thought, but as a lived reality. Chapter 20, Non-Resistance and Inner Freedom. One of the most radical ideas in the Sermon on the Mount is non-resistance. Do not resist an evildoer. Tolstoy wrestled with this for years. It seemed passive, weak, a refusal to fight back. But as he lived with it, he began to understand it differently. Non-resistance was not about letting evil win. It was about refusing to become evil yourself. When you resist with violence, you become what you fight. When you meet hatred with hatred, you multiply it. Non-resistance was a way to break the cycle. Not by doing nothing, but by refusing to respond in kind. This required strength, not weakness. It required a kind of inner freedom that most people do not have, the freedom to choose your response, even when every instinct screams to fight back. Tolstoy saw this as the key to personal peace. Not peace as the absence of conflict, but peace as the refusal to be controlled by it. You cannot control what others do to you, but you can control how you respond. And in that control, that choice, lies your freedom. This was not abstract philosophy. It was deeply practical. He applied it to his own life, to the arguments with his wife, to the frustrations with the estate, to the anger that rose when he was misunderstood. Instead of fighting, he softened. Instead of resisting, he accepted. And it changed him. Not all at once, but slowly. He became calmer, more patient, less tormented by the need to control outcomes. Notice the air moving in and out. Non-resistance is one of the hardest practices because it goes against every survival instinct. When you are attacked, you want to fight back. When you are wronged, you want justice. But Tolstoy learned that fighting back often just perpetuates suffering. The anger you hold onto corrodes you more than it harms the other person. The grudge you carry weighs on you, not on them. Non-resistance is letting go, not because the other person deserves it, but because you do. Chapter 21. Love as the only law. Tolstoy came to believe that there was only one law worth following: love. Not romantic love, not sentimental affection, but love as a practice, a way of seeing, a refusal to dehumanize. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. Love those who harm you. This was the core of what Jesus taught, and it was the core of what Tolstoy came to live by. But he understood it in a specific way. Love was not a feeling, it was a choice. You do not wait to feel loving before acting lovingly. You act lovingly, and the feeling follows. This was liberating, because it meant love was always available. Even when you did not feel it, you could choose to speak kindly, to listen patiently, to give generously. Even when your heart was closed, even when you were tired, even when the other person was difficult. Love as practice, not feeling, made it sustainable. Tolstoy also saw that love was the only thing that did not lead to emptiness. Pleasure fades. Achievement is forgotten. Power corrupts. But love, genuine, selfless love, does not diminish the one who gives it. It expands them. Every time you act out of love, you become more capable of love. Every time you choose compassion over cruelty, you strengthen the part of you that is worth strengthening. This was meaning, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality. You give love, and in giving it, you become more alive. Let your jaw soften. Tolstoy later wrote that love was the only rational response to life. Not because it solved the problem of death, it did not, but because it made life worth living, even in the face of death. When you love, you are not thinking about the void. You are participating in something that feels real. And that participation, that connection, is its own answer. Not to the question why, but to the question how. How to live, how to endure, how to find meaning in a life that ends. Love, that was the answer. Simple, radical, difficult, and true. Chapter 22. Simplicity against vanity. Tolstoy began to change his life. He had always lived comfortably. As a member of the Russian aristocracy, he had wealth, servants, fine clothes, a large estate, but he started to see this as vanity, not because wealth itself was evil, but because it distanced him from the life he wanted to live. The peasants he admired lived simply. They owned little, they needed little, and their simplicity gave them something he lacked: a directness, a clarity. Tolstoy began to strip away the excess. He dressed more plainly. He worked the land himself. He gave away money. He refused titles and honors. His family resisted. His wife, Sophia, especially. She had worked hard to manage the estate, to secure their children's future. And here was Tolstoy, trying to give it all away. The tension between them grew, but Tolstoy persisted. He believed that simplicity was not just a lifestyle choice, it was a spiritual practice. Every luxury you cling to is a chain. Every possession you accumulate is a weight, not because things are bad, but because they distract. They keep you focused on maintaining, on protecting, on accumulating more. And all of that takes energy that could be spent living. Tolstoy wanted to live, not to manage, and simplicity was the path. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. This is a hard teaching, especially in a culture that equates success with accumulation. But Tolstoy saw that accumulation leads to anxiety, not peace. The more you have, the more you fear losing. The simpler you live, the freer you are. He did not become a monk. He did not abandon his family. But he did strip away the layers of vanity, the need to impress, the need to own. And in that stripping away, he found something. Not happiness, but clarity, the ability to see what mattered and to let go of what did not. Chapter 23: Art, Conscience, and Truth. Tolstoy also rethought his relationship with art. He had written two of the greatest novels in history. But after his crisis, he could not write fiction the same way. He no longer cared about beauty for its own sake, or entertainment, or literary prestige. He cared about truth. Art, he came to believe, had a moral purpose. Not to preach, but to awaken conscience, to help people see themselves more clearly, to connect them to something real. He wrote essays on art, on ethics, on religion. He wrote stories that were simpler, more direct, less ornate, and he judged his earlier work harshly. War and Peace, Anna Karenina, he saw them as the work of a man who had not yet understood what mattered. They were brilliant, but they were empty. This is controversial. Many readers love those novels precisely because of their richness, their depth. But for Tolstoy, they no longer felt true. He wanted to write what would help people live, not what would impress them. This shift alienated some of his admirers. They wanted more novels, more beauty, more genius. But Tolstoy was done performing. He wrote what he believed. Even when it was unpopular, he criticized the church, the government, the wealthy. He argued for non-violence, for simplicity, for a life rooted in conscience. And he did so knowing it would cost him, but the cost was worth it. Because he was finally writing the truth. Let the next breath come slower. There is a moment in every life when you realize you can no longer perform. You can no longer pretend. You can no longer say what people want to hear. You have to speak what you believe, or stay silent. Tolstoy chose to speak, and it changed his relationship with the world, but it deepened his relationship with himself. Chapter 24, Living Without Fear of Death. Tolstoy never fully conquered his fear of death. He was honest about this. Even in his final years, the question lingered, but it no longer paralyzed him, because he had found a way to live that did not require immortality. He lived simply. He loved deeply. He worked with his hands. He spoke what he believed. And in doing these things, he stopped asking why. Not because the question was answered, but because it became irrelevant. When you are living fully, the question of why you are living fades into the background. It is like asking why you are breathing while you breathe. The doing is the answer. Tolstoy later wrote that death was still terrifying, but it was no longer meaningless, because the life he had lived, with all its struggles, its doubts, its failures, had been real. He had loved, he had tried, he had changed, and that was enough. Not because it justified existence philosophically, but because it made existence bearable. He died in 1910 at the age of 82. He had left his home in the final days. Trying to escape or find something, he collapsed at a train station and died in the station master's house. His last words, reportedly, were about love, about the millions of people in the world, and how little love there was among them. He did not die with perfect peace, but he died having lived. And that is more than many people can say. Feel your feet on the ground, or the weight of your legs. Tolstoy's story is not a perfect resolution. He struggled, he made mistakes, he hurt people he loved. But he did not give up. He did not succumb to the void. He found a way to live, and in finding it, he showed that it is possible, even when the question has no answer. Chapter 25, The Quiet After the Collapse. And so we return to where we began, a room at night, silent, still, a man asking a question that has no answer. But now the question has changed shape. It is no longer, why am I here? It is, how should I live? And the answer is not in a book, or a theory, or a belief. It is in the doing. You live simply. You love deeply. You act with conscience, not because these things guarantee meaning, but because they create it. Meaning is not something you find, it is something you build, day by day, choice by choice. And when the night comes and the question returns, you do not need to answer it. You just need to remember what you did today. The kindness you showed, the patience you practiced, the love you gave, and in remembering, you see that the life you are living is the answer. Tolstoy collapsed at 50, and he rebuilt not with certainty, not with answers, but with trust and practice and love. You can do the same. Not because the question is easy, but because the alternative is unbearable. And so you keep going, not in triumph, but in quiet faithfulness. One day, one choice, one breath. Let your shoulders drop. The collapse is not the end. It is the beginning. The place where the false self falls away and the real life starts. Chapter 26. A practice in release. Let us pause here for a moment. Not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to feel. Right now, you are holding something. Maybe it is a question you have carried for years. Maybe it is a burden that is not yours. Maybe it is the weight of trying to understand everything before you can rest. You do not need to name it, just notice it. Where do you feel it in your body? Maybe your chest, maybe your jaw, maybe the back of your neck. Let your attention rest there for a moment. You do not need to change it. You do not need to push it away. Just notice. Now, imagine opening your hands, not physically, but inwardly. Imagine releasing the grip you have been holding, the effort to control, the need to know. You do not need to throw it away. Just stop holding it so tightly. Feel the difference between holding and allowing. Holding is effort. Allowing is rest. And tonight, you do not need to hold. You can let the questions sit beside you, not inside you, not gripping you, just beside you. You are here. They are there. And in that space, that small distance, there is freedom. Take one slow breath and let the tightness soften, even just a little. You do not need to have it all figured out tonight. You just need to rest and trust that the life you are living with all its doubt and uncertainty is enough. When you are ready, we will continue. Chapter 27. A 7-day path. Here is a gentle path, not a prescription, just an invitation. 7 days, 7 small practices, one at a time. Day 1. Notice. 1. Letting go. Today, notice one thing you are holding on to that you could release. Not a big thing, a small one, a resentment, an expectation, a need to be right. Just notice it. And if you feel ready, set it down for today. Not forever, just for today. See what that feels like. Day 2, speak one truth. Today, Say one true thing you have been avoiding, to yourself or to someone else, not to hurt, but to be honest. I am tired. I need help. I do not know. One sentence. That is all. And notice what happens when you stop pretending. Day 3, give without needing thanks. Today, do one kind thing that no one will notice. Hold a door, let someone go first. Speak gently to yourself when you make a mistake. Do it without needing recognition, and notice how kindness feels when it is just for itself. Day 4, sit with the question. Today, spend 5 minutes sitting with a question you usually avoid. Not to answer it, just to sit with it. Let it be there, let it be uncomfortable, and when the 5 minutes are over, let it go. You do not need to solve it. You just need to stop running from it. Day 5, work as offering. Today, do one task, any task, as if it mattered, not because it will be remembered, but because doing it well is its own meaning. Wash the dish carefully. Write the sentence clearly. Listen fully. Let the act be the point, not the outcome. Day 6, love without expecting return. Today, offer love to someone who may not return it. A difficult family member, a stranger, yourself. Not because they deserve it, but because giving it makes you more capable of giving. And that capacity is what matters. Day 7, trust one more day. Tonight, before sleep, say this to yourself, silently or aloud. I do not know why I am here, but I trust that there is a reason, and tomorrow I will try again. That is all. One more day, one more try, that is enough. Chapter 28, The Quiet After the Collapse. And so we close where we began. A man in a room. A question with no answer. But the question has changed. It is no longer a weapon, it is just a question. And the man is still here. Breathing, living, trying. Tolstoy did not solve the meaning of life. He learned to live it, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with intention, with love, with conscience. And in the living, the question became quieter, not because it was answered, but because it was no longer the only voice in the room. There was also the voice of the child laughing, the sound of the rain, the warmth of bread, the small, real things that do not justify life philosophically, but make it bearable humanly. You do not need to collapse the way Tolstoy did. But if you have, if the ground has shifted beneath you, know this: the collapse is not the end. It is the clearing, the place where the false structures fall away. And you see what was always underneath. Not answers, but life itself, given, unearned, waiting. And your task is not to justify it, but to live it, simply, honestly, lovingly, one day, one choice, one breath. Let your body rest, let your mind soften, and trust just for tonight that this is enough. The years teach what the days never could, and tomorrow you will try again